In a few years from now, hopefully sooner than that, the violence and the destruction in Syria will end. I don't know when it will happen. God willing, it'll be as soon as possible. But when it does end, and the international community can safely go to this land, the whole world's gonna hang its head in shame. Because it's almost impossible to begin to describe the abject horror and devastation that has befallen the Syrian people. There's not one single person in the United States who's done anything close to enough to help them. Starting, and I say, me too. I will tell you that it's true that I am a Muslim, and because of that, I got a lot of friends who are also Muslim, and many of them are from Syria, and they have come to me since the very beginning and said, hey man, this thing is serious, and the world has to do something about it. I've gone to the House floor to talk about a young man named Hamza, who was a little boy who was taken into custody and was beaten, murdered, abused, and given back to his family in horrible condition. You wonder, why would they do this to a child? Well, there's a very logical reason why they would do that to a child. And the logical reason is that it's one thing for you as a grown man or woman to go out there and do battle with the Syrian army. But if you see your baby mutilated, it takes the fight out of you. Because you don't mind dying yourself for a worthy cause. But your child, it'll do things to anyone. Anyway, I don't want to be long because I want you to hear from Qusai as soon as possible. But I simply do want to tell you that just, sometimes the facts matter. And I can tell you this, just to give you a sense. And again, the biggest number is 1. But I'm going to give you some numbers bigger than 1. The United Nations says there's about 150,000 people killed. I've never met a Syrian who said that that's an accurate number. They all say double it. The United Nations says 150, maybe it's as high as 300,000 dead. There's not one single country bordering Syria that does not have dramatic humanitarian crisis spilling over the borders everywhere. I'm talking Syria, I'm talking Iraq, Jordan, Lebanon, Turkey, everywhere around. People from Lebanon come back and describe horrific situations with refugees needing health care and food. There's a group of Syrian doctors who are Syrian American doctors who have gone back and forth, and they come back describing injuries that'll turn your stomach, including eyes being scooped out with a spoon. And that's just some of it. Of course, Bashar al-Assad attacked the Syrian people with chemical weapons, and it brought the world to crisis, and we all were on the brink of what we thought was going to be armed intervention by the United States. That was averted by the deal. I want you all to know the position I took on that was rooted purely in my concern for the Syrian people. And as you say, we agree to disagree on some things. But anyway, the deal was averted, thank God, I guess. But what did happen is that Bashar al-Assad agreed to stop the chemical weapons, but he has been identified as attacking people with chlorine bombs now. So let me just say, we have somebody who's been on the front line to tell us about it. I earnestly pray that the outrage sufficient to this outrage begins to rise. I think some of the outrage that we don't have is because we just don't know what to do. And so Qusai can give us some insight on what we might do to be helpful. But I'll say that of the 9 million total Syrian refugees, with about 6.5 million internally displaced, there's more than 1 million Syrian refugees in Lebanon, 600,000 in Jordan. That's 600,000 is twice the number of Minneapolis. just to give you it. So Minneapolis being twice, so Minneapolis and St. Paul and some suburbs being displaced from there into another country. Think about that for a moment. I also just want to tell you, I met Bashar al-Assad. There's actually pictures with me standing next to him. This was in April 2007, when Nancy Pelosi led a delegation to Syria, which is the first time that any U.S. delegation went there. And many people thought, you know, maybe this guy's going to be different from his father, who had murdered 20,000 people in Hama in the mid-1980s. And people hoped that it was going to be different. Well, what Bashar al-Assad has done to the Syrian people outpaces his father's brutality many times over. Qusai Zakarya is a 28-year-old Syrian-Palestinian descent who grew up in Moadamiya, a town in the outskirts of Damascus. Moadamiya is hit by chemical weapons August 2013, and Qusai was one of the thousands exposed to sarin gas. His city has been suffering for over a year from starvation, siege enforced by the Assad regime. As a result, Qusai has begun a hunger strike on November 26, 2013. In a show of support, the International Solidarity Hunger Strike for Syria was kicked off in Minnesota to support his demand to lift the siege. After 33 days, Qusai ended his hunger strike on December 20th, 2014. Brother, thank you so much for your heroic, absolutely inestimable courage. We stand with you, and we need to do more than just stand with you. We need to help you get peace for the people of Syria. Please put your hands together for a heroic figure in our world today, Qusai.
My name is Qusai. I recently came from Syria, from a small town in the west suburbs of Damascus called Moadamiya. Before I start talking, I just like to add a few comments about what I heard. The problem or the conflict in Syria, like some may call it, didn't start in March 15, 2011. Since Hafez al-Assad, the father of Bashar al-Assad, took the rule of Syria in the 70s, he established a sectarian regime built on pure loyalty for the Assad family and the Assad family alone. It wasn't built for Syria or for the Syrian people. It was only built for al-Assad family. So when people in the 80s started thinking about having some kind of political opposition for the regime, Hafez al-Assad established al-Ba'ath party, and it was the only political party allowed to, to operate in Syria. Hafez al-Assad and his brother Rafat al-Assad invaded Hama, and they killed over 25,000 civilians, displacing hundreds of thousands, arresting thousands of people, and most of them are still missing until these days. So like father, like son, and maybe even worse, Bashar al-Assad didn't hesitate for a second to use violence against the uprising that started in March 15, 2011, after small kids in Dar'a started writing the words of freedom on their school walls, and the regime responded in arresting the small kids and tortured them, and when their families tried to ask for setting them free, the regime started shooting at them, and people started to demonstrate, and it was the spark that lighted up the Syrian uprising. Our first demonstration in Moadamiya happened in March 21st, 2011. All of us went to the streets screaming and roaring the words of freedom. We all been waiting to this day to be able to just walk in the street and say the word freedom, and for the first time ever we felt free. We felt that the barriers of fear, like Suzanne was saying, it was broken. The regime didn't hesitate for a second to use violence against the peaceful demonstrations, and especially because Moadamiya is surrounded by the Assad most powerful military divisions, starting with the 4th Division, which is a big military division run by Maher al-Assad, the brother of Bashar al-Assad, And also we were surrounded by the Mizza military air base, the headquarters of the Air Force Intelligence, one of the biggest security branches the Assad regime have. And also we had the Republican guards from the western side of the town. So literally we were surrounded by all sides, and the regime started using violence. They sent their troops, their mercenaries, their intelligent patrols, and they started shooting at civilians, arresting people, torture them in the middle of the streets, making field executions. They went inside people's houses and they started raping women in front of their families in order to terrify them and stop them from continuing with the Syrian revolution. During the 7 to 8 months of the peaceful demonstrations, we were always asking the international community at least to have some kind of protection for the civilians and the peaceful demonstrations. But unfortunately, nobody stepped ahead and did anything to protect us and to protect our families. And that caused some honorable men in the Syrian army to dissent and establish small groups of Free Syrian Army to defend the peaceful demonstrations and civilians. In Moadamiya, young men in the town started raising some light weapons like AKs and shotguns, and they started to stand against the Assad intelligence patrols to show them that there will be consequences if they were going to keep on using violence against us. The regime was always trying to force us to raise weapons so he can use more weapons and more firepower against us. This is the game that he can play the best, using weapons. And people just wanted to be left alone, but the regime didn't stop. They responded in invading Moadamiya twice in the beginning of 2012, killing over 450 civilians during 2 terrifying massacres. Most of them were butchered by knives or burned alive in the middle of the streets. And they wrote, the Assad regime troops wrote their famous motto with the victims' blood on the walls of Moadamiya, that it's either Assad or we will burn the country. And literally, they fulfilled their motto. After the second invasion, we were screaming, begging, talking to everybody in the international community, asking for protection to stop the regime from using all this massive amount of power against the civilian populations in Moadamiya and other places in Syria. But again, nobody did anything. So people in Moadamiya gathered around, and they started talking about establishing a Free Syrian Army division to protect the town and what's left of the civilians. After over 55,000 civilians was displaced from Moadamiya because of the Assad violence and shelling, invasions, and also car bombs. The regime sent over 13 car bombs into Moadamiya. So people started donating money. A lot of people sold their houses or their wives' jewelries, and we started getting weapons from corrupted regime officers or sometimes from good regime officers who smuggled in some of their weapons to us so we can protect our families. And after we managed to establish a strong FSA division in Moadamiya, the regime tried to invade a couple of times, but they failed. So the response was to put the town under complete siege on November 2012, and they shut off all the basic supplies of life, starting with power and gas and telephones. They stopped all the aid, the food, the medicine, everything from coming into Moadamiya. Anybody who tried to come in or out from the town, they would have either get shot by the Assad snipers or worse, to get captured and tortured to death. Personally, I helped burying a lot of these civilians. I remember a guy called Abu Muhammad. Abu Muhammad was a 42 years old man, and he had his daughter and his wife back in Moadamiya while he was working in Damascus when the siege started. His daughter was suffering from medical problems, and she needed a special kind of medicine that wasn't available in Moadamiya, especially after the regime targeted the understructure of the town, starting with the hospitals. He destroyed the 3 hospitals that we used to have in Moadamiya. We only had 8 doctors for over 13,500 civilians who were left when the siege started. So Abu Muhammad risked his life in January 2013, and he tried to sneak into the town, bringing the medicine to his daughter, and the Assad troops got him. They tortured him to death, and they threw his body in the nearby road in highway number 40 from the northern side of the town, and they left a note upon his body saying, "This is what's gonna happen to anybody will try to come in or out from Moadamiya." And again, they signed the letter with their famous motto, "It's either Assad or we will burn the country." We were again asking and begging at this point at least to have some aid coming into the town, to have some food, some medicine for the besieged 13,500 civilians in Moadamiya. We knew at that time that there won't be any kind of help coming from anywhere, at least to stop the regime from using weapons, MiG fighters, land-to-land missiles, artillery, tanks, mortars, every heavy weapon the regime have, they were using it on Moadamiya and, of course, a lot of other places all across Syria. But we were at least thinking about having some aid into the town. We managed to survive the first couple of months of the siege by relying on the small food storage that people in country towns usually have, because we don't have a lot of supermarkets. So people had some extra amounts of sugar and rice and spaghetti, the kind of food that can last for a little while. And of course, the shelling and the bombardment never stopped on Moadamiya. The regime, like I told you, was surrounding the town from all sides, and they didn't hesitate in using all the heavy weapons that they had. But in August 21st, 2013, the regime didn't stop on using traditional weapons to attack civilian populations in Syria. I think Bashar al-Assad knew that after over 2 years of using all kinds of weapons that he had, and without having any fears of consequences from the international community, he thought that even using chemical weapons somehow or some way will be okay. So the regime launched a massive chemical attack on eastern Ghouta and on Moadamiya as well. Moadamiya was the only town in the west suburbs of Damascus which got struck with sarin in August 21st, because like I told you, it was a small town but yet a strategical town for the Assad regime to control. I was one of the people who got exposed by the sarin gas, and my heart stopped for around 3 minutes, and I was placed among the deceased for around 45 minutes. It was a pure miracle for me to come back alive and maybe be here with you to share my story. I was up doing my Fajr prayer around 4:45 a.m. when I started hearing terrifying alarms coming from Damascus, the kind of alarms that we usually hear in movies about World War II when there is a big air raid or something like this. Within seconds, I started hearing rockets flying into low distance to the ground. They sounded like a small air jet flying close to the ground. And when they landed and crashed, they didn't make the same old-fashioned bombing sound. We got used to all the Assad weapons, so we could tell the kind of weapon they are using just from hearing the sound of the weapon. Before I realized what was going on, I lost my ability to breathe. I felt like my chest was set on fire and my eyes were burning like hell. I wasn't able even to scream to alert my friends who were staying with me in the apartment. So I started beating my chest over and over really hard until I managed to get my first breath. It was so painful. It felt like somebody staring up my chest with a knife made of fire. I started screaming to alert my friends that it might be a chemical attack. And while we were trying to get dressed, one of our neighbors knocked on our door, and she had 2 of her kids, one at the age of 4 and the other one at the age of 6. Both of them were suffocating and vomiting weird white stuff out of their mouths. So at that point, I realized that it is a chemical attack and there's no questions to ask. One of my friends was a member in the Free Syrian Army, and he told us that we should go get his car and try to get as much civilians as we can to the field hospital. So we ran to the street, and the scene was so terrifying. I always use the expression of Judgment Day to describe what it felt like for me to see men and women, older and men and children, all of them running, falling on the ground, suffocating without seeing a single drop of blood. The amount of confusion and terror was unbearable. It got into my attention to see a small kid in the age of 13 maybe. He was laying on the ground, suffocating, and nobody was close enough to help him. So I ran to check on him, and I think the expression that I've seen on his face was one of the most terrifying images that I've seen during the past 3 years of the Syrian Revolution, even though I saw terror that you cannot even see in your worst nightmares. He had wide blue eyes, and he was almost staring into another dimension while he was suffocating. He seemed so innocent and pure to die this way, without doing anything wrong, except of living in a town raised against a dictator, and this dictator can do whatever he wants without having any fears of consequences. So I tried to give him CPR. I started screaming and asking for help. And almost 2 minutes later, my friend managed to get his car. He had almost 6 children and 3 ladies. All of them were exposed. There was no room for us, but I insisted to take the kids, so I placed him in the trunk of the car. I sat next to him to make sure he's not gonna fall, and my friend drove really fast to the field hospital. When we arrived there, the scene was even more and more terrifying to see hundreds and hundreds of people exposed. The minute my friend stopped his car, I lost my conscience, and I fell out of the car and I hit the ground. At that point, my heart stopped because of the chemical exposure. My friends took me inside of the field hospital. The doctors tried to get my heart working for almost 3 minutes by giving me CPR and a shot of atropine, washing my body with water. But then they gave up. They had hundreds of people to look after, and like I told you, we only had 8 doctors for 13,500 civilians. So they placed me among the deceased until almost 45 minutes later, a friend of mine who was also helping rescuing civilians saw me laying with the deceased. He ran to check on me and he started crying and shaking me until he noticed that I was still moving somehow. So he called the doctors again, and they gave me extra shots of atropine and CPR and kept washing my body over and over with water until I came back to conscious almost 30 minutes later. When I came back to conscious, I was standing in the middle of the street nearby the field hospital, and the earth was literally shaking under my feet. The regime was bombing the town like World War II. He used unbelievable amount of power, brand new Russian and Iranian missiles with massive ability of destruction. They had their special forces dressed up in full chemical gear, and they were trying to invade really hard. It was another pure miracle that the Free Syrian Army managed to stand against the Assad invasion with their light weapons and lack of ammo. But like I told you, most of the members of the Free Syrian Army in Moadamiya, just like in other places in Syria, were just young men from the town defending their own families after terrifying massacres. So everybody knew if their regime will be able to invade, they won't leave a breathing soul. They will attempt terrifying massacres just like they did in Moadamiya, in Homs, in Idlib, in Daraa, all across Syria. 5 days later, the United Nations Weapons Inspectors team arrived to Moadamiya. It was the first town they managed to enter to make an investigation about the chemical attack. And even though the regime shot at their vehicles and they bombed the town while they were trying to enter to scare them away, but they were brave enough to enter, I had to pull myself together and escort them to take advantage of my English skills to provide accurate description and information about what happened. They went to the field hospital, they examined patients, they took blood samples, tissues, they went to the crashing zones, they examined some of the rockets that was used in the chemical attack, and they went the next day to Eastern Ghouta as well. They examined the other towns that was struck with chemical weapons, and they wrote a full report to the Security Council and the United Nations saying that the rockets were fired from regime-held areas, and everybody know that the regime, we all knew since before the chemical attack that the regime have chemical weapons, but he always denied existence for over 4 decades. The regime never declared to the world that he had chemical weapons, while everybody knew that they do. I'd just like to put a small note about the chemical attack, that President Obama drew the red line of using the chemical weapons, and there will be consequences, like President Obama said, in using chemical weapons a couple of days before the chemical attack. And that shows that the United States of America and other countries did already had informations about a possible chemical attack that's going to happen in Syria. That's why they drew the red line only a couple of days before the chemical attack. Well, like everybody knew, President Obama was supposed to have consequences on using even chemical weapons in killing civilians in Syria. The international community was okay with the regime to use all the weapons that he had, all the traditional weapons, the MiG fighters, the choppers, the land-to-land missiles, everything, butchering people, burn them alive. But using chemical weapons was supposed to be the final red line for the regime, and using the chemical weapons was supposed to have consequences. But like we all knew, nothing happened. The United States and Russia and the international community signed up a deal with the Assad government, and in returns of handing over the chemical weapons, the regime will be safe from any consequences in using the chemical weapons. But just like Mr. Keith said, the regime is still using chlorine gas. Until now, the regime failed 3 deadlines in handing over the chemical weapons, and until now the regime only handed over 60% of the chemical weapons that he had. We were at that point too busy waiting for the so-called military strike or military operations, and all the world was busy with the possible military strike, and nobody was paying enough attention for the malnutrition symptoms that started to spread all over the town because of the lack of food, because at that time we were already run out of food, and we had only olives and leaves of trees, some simple herbs that we managed to plant between the buildings to survive on. People in Moadamiya turned like ghosts. Everybody was suffering from malnutrition. Personally, I lost over 30 pounds during the siege. And at that point, again, we were literally, and I'll say again, literally begging the United Nations, ICRC, the United States, everybody we managed to talk with to have humanitarian aid to enter Moadamiya and also the other besieged towns. The city of Daraya, which is a city right next to Moadamiya, it was put under the same siege in the same time. And people, thousands and thousands of people were suffering from malnutrition, but unfortunately nobody did anything again. The regime was using a new policy called الجوع أو الركوع. It means in English, it's either you kneel to Assad or you were starved to death. This picture was taken for some of the checkpoints the Assad regime have, and they were so proud and bragging about their new policy, how they're gonna make us starve to death or we're gonna have to be kneeling to Assad just to eat. This is how they wanted to humiliate us, just to have food on our tables. So I saw a lot of, like you can see, this picture for a small kid called Ibrahim Khalil. He died from malnutrition, like dozens of other children in Moadamiya. The next picture, this picture belongs to a small girl, her name used to be Rana Ubaid. I personally knew her father and her family a long time ago. This girl, believe it or not, her father used to have a grocery store. Imagine a guy who have a grocery store having his 18-month daughter starving to death. The Rana died because we didn't have children's milk in Moadamiya, just children's milk. We didn't ask for weapons or for anti-aircraft missiles or anything. We were just asking for children's milk, some food, some medicine. We lost over 200 civilians because of the lack of medicine and medical equipment as well. This is something people also should know, because the field hospital that we have, it was just a basement in a building with almost zero medical equipment. The doctors had to operate dozens and dozens of surgeries with almost zero medical equipment for different kinds of injuries by the constant shelling and bombardment on the town. After we managed to make some kind of noise and we embarrassed the international community, the Assad regime, the regime responded in making a maneuver in October 2013 by evacuating civilians from Moadamiya instead of entering aid into the town. At that time, I started talking with the notorious nun Agnes Mariam. She was working as a middleman for the regime. She promised us, even though for people who doesn't know who Agnes Mariam is, she's a Lebanese nun who was living in Syria, and since the beginning of the uprising, she was always going from a media channel into another, going from a place to another, saying that there is nothing wrong going on in Syria. You will see dozens of videos of her on YouTube saying this, and nobody is shooting at the civilians. All what we can hear and see in Syria are terrorists coming from different places, shooting at the civilians as they are accusing the army in doing this. There was no invasions, there was no bombing, there was no massacres happening in Syria. And believe it or not, she denied the entire chemical massacre on August 21st. And to make things even worse, she had a nomination for a Nobel Prize for Peace. Yes. And we had to take whatever we got or whatever we can have. We left the people with the freedom of choice to stay or to leave. Personally, I went to the checkpoints and I started talking with the civilians who were getting out from Moadamiya, telling them, how can you risk your life this way, knowing that you will be either arrested or killed? Their simple answer, believe it or not, was, we prefer to die on a full stomach than to die on an empty stomach. This is how desperate people were in Moadamiya. Starving to death is something that can destroy your mind, your soul, your beliefs before it can destroy your body. It's one of the most filthy and silent weapons the Assad regime used so far. Most of the people who were evacuated were women and children, some elders and wounded civilians. Most of them got arrested, interrogated, tortured, field executed. A lot of women got raped again, and again, nobody did anything. And after, we had 4 evacuation attempts. In the 3rd evacuation, believe it or not, while people were gathering nearby one of the checkpoints, the regime bombed the area in front of ICRC and some members of press, and they just ride their vehicles and they ran away. The regime took over hundreds of the civilians and made them as a human shield and tried to invade the town using the civilians. After the evacuation, we had around 8,000 civilians left in Moadamiya. The bombing and shelling never stopped. The food was something that became a myth in Moadamiya. Again, we only had olives and leaves of trees to survive on. And it seemed to me that nobody was paying enough attention for the Assad starvation weapon. Because like I told you, it's a silent weapon. It doesn't make a lot of noise to kill people. It will take a lot of time. Imagine yourself coming back to home each and every day. You have your family, your children, and they don't have anything to eat for days and days and days and days. You can't even come back home if you have a family and look at your children's eyes and know that they are hungry and you cannot do anything for them. So I decided to do a hunger strike in the end of 2013 to raise awareness against the Assad starvation weapon, to make a stand against using food as a weapon of war, and also to remind people about nonviolent acts that we were trying to do even in the worst and most complicated situations. I was so blessed to have all these amazing people from all around the world supporting the hunger strike and doing solidarity hunger strikes. And we managed to do a lot of noise. But again, unfortunately, we weren't able to have a happy ending, to see the food coming in, and except when at the end of 2013, the storm Alexa hit the Middle East. It was a big snowstorm that hit the Middle East and Syria and Moadamiya as well. We were already starving to death and we began to freeze to death. The regime took the advantage of the situation and he sent us an offer for a so-called truce, and in return of allowing small shipments of food, we had to raise the regime flag and hand over weapons, which is our only guarantee for safety. Hand over dissent officers and soldiers and activists, and even assigning a military commander by the Assad regime to run Moadamiya. That was our only option to have food, because it seemed that nobody's going to do anything to help us. So we had to say yes. We started having small shipments of food coming into the town, and we had to pay millions of Syrian pounds to enter this aid, which was supposed to be free, coming from the United Nations and ICRC. So it was a pure blackmail to have the small shipments of food coming into Moadamiya. I managed to get out miraculously from Moadamiya in the end of February 2014. It will take a lot of time to explain how I did it, but I was so blessed to be able to get out. If anybody saw the movie Arago by Ben Affleck, I think I was Ben Affleck in that movie. And believe it or not, I saw the movie while I was on the airplane coming here to the United States. And they went there, they got evidence, they went to other places, got stroked with chemical weapons on August 21st. They are professionals. They came from the United Nations. They didn't come from the United States or from any other country. So they had They were working as a neutralized party. So there is no room for rumors and conspiracy theories that we hear every once and then, that it might be Al-Qaeda or Turkey, or sometimes aliens from Mars who used chemical weapons on August 21st. Anybody who have information how complicated is just having and storing chemical weapons will know that only the regime have these kinds of weapon, and he can launch a chemical weapons attack. It's not something simple to have sarin and other kind of gas and store it and use it.
Indeed, I'd ask every member of Congress and those of you watching at home tonight to view those videos of the attack. And then ask, what kind of world will we live in if the United States of America sees a dictator brazenly violate international law with poison gas, and we choose to look the other way? When Assad's government gassed to death over 1,000 people, including hundreds of children. The images from this massacre are sickening. Men, women, children lying in rows, killed by poison gas. Others foaming at the mouth, gasping for breath. A father clutching his dead children, imploring them to get up and walk. On that terrible night, the world saw in gruesome detail the terrible nature of chemical weapons, and why the overwhelming majority of humanity has declared them off limits, a crime against humanity. When dictators commit atrocities, they depend upon the world to look the other way.
You can be emotional for just a few minutes after you see this video, I think. But you will be completely destroyed if you just lived in Syria for an hour under these circumstances. What President Obama did and what the international community did when they signed up with this deal with the Assad regime was giving all the dictators and lunatics on this planet a strong message and a wrong message in the same time, that it's okay to use anything or to do anything as long as you will come up with a deal in the end of the day. And there won't be any consequences. You can just do whatever you want because there won't be consequences. The documented numbers of the Syrian casualties are over 150,000. The United Nations stopped counting in the beginning of 2014. The numbers can be way, way higher. Recently, there was 55,000 images, leaked images for 11,000 prisoners who were tortured to death in one single intelligent branch the Assad regime have, The Assad regime have over 17 different intelligent branches in Syria. So imagine how the numbers can be terrifying. These pictures were examined by different intelligence agencies and specialists all around the world. And everybody examined these pictures, said that it's very similar to the Holocaust because of the way of the organizing, killing, documenting, and counting the prisoners. And again, it's just was leaked from one single intelligence branch, and we have 17 intelligence branches in Syria. We have hundreds of thousands of missing people. We're not just talking about the prisoners, so I think the numbers can be so terrifying. Over 10 million people are displaced inside and outside of Syria. Until now, 1.5 million people are still starving to death in Syria. 90% of the aid given by the United Nations has to go through the Assad regime to be handed over to the civilians, like they say. We have a lot of documentations about the regime handing over this aid to regime-held areas, to their own troops. Sometimes they put stickers on this aid, and they say it's a gift from the Syrian army. And like I told you earlier, right now Bashar al-Assad is re-electing himself again for president. He's making a very pathetic play about having decent elections right now. He sent some of the officials in his government to run against him to show the world that it's a democracy in Syria, and he's gonna win. And we are going to have him as president for another 7 years. So imagine the Syrian people living for another 7 years under the brutality of the Assad regime. Bashar al-Assad in the middle of 2011 promised to turn Syria into a new Afghanistan, and he fulfilled his promise. Right now we have one of the biggest al-Qaeda bases in the world. There is tons of links between the regime and al-Qaeda, between the regime and ISIS, the Islamic State of Iraq and Sham. The regime never bombs the areas held by ISIS. They never had any kind of military battles. They never, the Al-Qaeda always sells oil to the regime. We have the Free Syrian Army fighting both of the Assad regime and Al-Qaeda. And let's not forget that the regime is getting thousands and thousands of well-trained mercenaries and troops from the Revolutionary Guards from Iran, from Hezbollah, from Iraq and other countries. All of them are well-trained and they have a lot of firepower. They are getting unlimited military equipments from Russia and Iran. And like everybody knows, Russia is always covering politically the regime in the Security Council and in all around the world. I want to thank you all for coming here, but before I finish, I'd just like to remind you that it's not enough to just attend an event and to feel sorry for a couple of minutes, to show sympathy, and then go home and forget everything that you have seen. I really hope that all of us should become more involved in supporting the Syrian people and pressuring the United States government to take actions against the regime. We don't want to see any Iraqi or Afghani scenario in Syria. This is something we said it thousands of times, loud and clear, but we are asking for having consequences for war crimes in Syria and pressuring the regime to allow unconditional humanitarian aid. And also we want support for the Free Syrian Army who's fighting al-Qaeda and the regime at the same time. We like to see the international community stopping the regime from using barrel bombs. The regime, after they sign up for the chemical deal, started using barrel bombs throwing big barrels filled with TNT and explosives from choppers on civilian population. One barrel bomb can wipe up an entire block, just one. The regime used, during Geneva, they used barrel bombs in a very heavy way. People even started talking and saying about these barrel bombs, describing it as Geneva barrels. And that happened during the peace talks that was happening in Geneva between the regime and the Syrian opposition under international presence. The Syrian people are moderate. They love and cherish life. Damascus and Aleppo are one of the oldest cities and capitals in history. We know how to live together. What we are asking is to build a free country, Syria for all, and this is what we are hoping for. I'd just like to remind you that we're gonna start doing again solidarity hunger strikes maybe each Thursday, because we still have people starving to death in Syria, and your help is really appreciated. Thank you, and God bless you.